Daniel had lived on the outer edge of the colony for 3 years, and in all that time his alien neighbor Liara had been nothing more than a quiet presence. Beyond the thin boundary wall that separated their homes, her kind rarely spoke to humans. Beyond formal trade exchanges, but Daniel had always been aware of her in the same way one noticed the presence of a storm far out at sea. Distant but undeniable. Then one evening he saw something different. Liara was standing on her balcony, under the pale light of the twin moons. The smooth silver of her skin now alive with faint glowing patterns that pulsed like the slow rhythm of a heartbeat. Daniel frowned. He had seen her pass by dozens of times before, and never once had she looked like this. Her movements were sharper, her gaze more focused. When her eyes met his across the divide, he felt something shift. As if the air between them had thickened, she gave the smallest nod before disappearing inside. That night he couldn't shake the image from his mind. The patterns on her skin seemed to flash behind his eyes even when he closed them. The next morning he found her at his door, her voice low and edged with something he couldn't place. She asked if he had noticed anything unusual lately. Daniel hesitated before saying yes. She seemed to study him for a long moment before nodding slowly, telling him that certain cycles had begun, cycles her people could not control, and that in the weeks to come he might see more changes before he could ask what she meant she was. Gone, moving with a speed and grace that left no sound on the gravel path. Over the next few days the changes became harder to ignore. Liara began appearing outside more often, sometimes watching him from across the boundary without speaking, sometimes passing close enough for him to hear a faint hum in the air, a sound that seemed to come from her rather than any machine. The other neighbors noticed too. Daniel caught one of them muttering about keeping their distance, about how dangerous it was to be near her during this time. But when Daniel pressed them for answers, they only shook their heads and told him to ask her himself. One evening as Daniel returned from the colony market, he found a small package on his doorstep. Inside was a smooth black stone that seemed to hold heat despite the cool air. No note, no explanation, but he knew it was from her. That night he heard soft footsteps outside his door, and when he opened it, Liara was there, closer than she had ever been, her eyes catching the light with an almost predatory gleam. She told him that the time was coming sooner than expected, that there were rules about contact during this season, but rules could be broken. Her voice was calm, yet carried an undercurrent that made his pulse quicken. As she turned to leave, he asked what exactly was happening to her. She paused at the edge of the shadows and said only 2 words. Mating season. Daniel felt a shiver crawl up his spine. He had heard rumors about what that meant among her kind, but they had always been just that, rumors. She stepped into the darkness without another word, leaving him staring after her, the black stone still warm in his hand. Later that night as he tried to sleep, he heard something through the thin walls. A low melodic hum that seemed to reach inside his chest and settle in his heartbeat. And as the sound grew stronger, he began to wonder if it was calling him or warning him. The storm rolled in without warning, thick clouds swallowing the pale light of the twin moons and throwing the colony into an uneasy darkness. Daniel sat inside listening to the wind rattle the thin walls when a sharp knock sounded at his door. Opening it, he found Liara standing there cloaked in a thin layer of rain, the glowing patterns on her skin brighter than before, pulsing in a rhythm that almost matched the pounding of his own heart. She asked in a voice low and urgent if he would come with her, that she needed his help with something that could not wait until morning. Daniel hesitated for a moment, but there was something in her eyes, not just insistence but a strange vulnerability. He grabbed his coat and followed her out into the storm. the rain stinging his face as they moved quickly through the winding paths between the homes. She led him to her own dwelling, a place he had never been invited into before. The door slid open to reveal an interior bathed in shifting light, the walls alive with slow rippling patterns like reflections in water. A low hum filled the space, deeper and more resonant than the one he had heard through the wall nights before. Liara moved inside with a grace that seemed almost inhuman, shedding her outer cloak and revealing more of those glowing markings that now covered her arms, shoulders, and the sides of her neck. She gestured for him to follow her down a narrow passage until they reached a circular chamber at the back of her home, its floor covered in intricate symbols carved into the smooth stone and inlaid with a faintly glowing material. Daniel could feel the heat radiating from the room, the air thick with a scent both sweet and metallic. Liara told him in a steady voice that her people's mating season was not only a time for choosing a partner, but also for renewal, for strengthening the bond between two beings so deeply that their minds and bodies could never be fully separated again. She said that she had chosen him, the words falling into the space between them with the weight of something irreversible. Daniel's breath caught. He wanted to ask why him, what this bond would mean for him, for her, for the colony. But before he could speak, she stepped closer, the patterns on her skin flaring brighter as if reacting to his presence. Her voice dropped to a whisper as she said that what she was offering him was not without risk. There were others of her kind who would see it as a threat, some who might even act to stop it before it could be completed. Daniel could hear the storm pounding against the roof, the wind rising like a warning. Liara reached for a small black vessel on a nearby table and poured a thick shimmering liquid into 2 shallow cups. She offered one to him and raised her own in a gesture that seemed ceremonial. Daniel stared at it, the surface catching the strange shifting light, the hum in the room pressing against his thoughts. When he finally took the cup, the warmth of the liquid seeped into his hands even before he drank it. Liara's gaze never left his face. As the taste hit his tongue, a rush of sensation flooded through him, flashes of colors and sounds he could not name, fragments of places he had never been yet somehow remembered. His knees almost buckled, but she steadied him with a hand on his shoulder, the touch sending another wave of strange heat through him. She told him they were not yet bonded, that this was only the first step, and that if he wished to turn back, he must do it now before the next stage began. Daniel's mind was spinning. The storm outside roared like the voice of something ancient and alive. He felt as if he stood on the edge of a precipice. Liara's eyes glowed faintly in the dim shifting light, waiting for his choice, and though he could not yet speak it, he knew that stepping away would not stop what had already begun. The storm had passed by morning, leaving the colony washed in silver light and damp air. Daniel woke with the memory of Lyra's chamber still vivid in his mind, the shifting lights, the hum that seemed to pulse through his bones, and the warmth of her hand on his shoulder. He tried to shake the thoughts away, but they lingered like the afterimage of a bright light. When he stepped outside, he noticed a figure standing at the far end of the path, tall and still, watching Lyra's home. The moment Daniel's gaze met theirs, the figure turned and walked away, disappearing behind a row of empty market stalls. He told himself it was nothing but a passing traveler, yet something about the deliberate stillness of that stance made his skin prickle. Later that day he saw Liara moving through the colony's outer fields. Her movements were quicker than usual, sharper, and she kept glancing over her shoulder as if she too felt the weight of unseen eyes. When she passed him, she spoke in a low voice without breaking stride, telling him to stay inside after dark. No explanation, just that. Daniel's instincts told him to press for more, but the look in her eyes silenced him. That night he sat by the narrow window in his living space, watching the shadows stretch across the quiet street. The hum from her home drifted faintly on the air, a sound that had once felt curious now edged with tension. It was near midnight when movement caught his eye, a shadow slipping over the low boundary wall into Lyra's yard. Daniel leaned forward, straining to see. The figure moved with purpose, heading straight for her door. Before he could decide whether to intervene, the door slid open and Lyra stepped out, her glowing patterns flaring to life with sudden intensity. In a blur of motion, she crossed the distance between them and caught the intruder by the arm. The speed and force of it startled Daniel. The figure tried to wrench free, but Lyra's grip was unyielding. She spoke in her own language, the words low and sharp. The intruder hissed something back before she flung them away with enough force to send them crashing into the boundary wall. They scrambled to their feet and fled into the darkness. Lyra stood still for a moment, scanning the shadows before, turning her gaze toward Daniel's window. For an instant their eyes locked, and Daniel felt the weight of what he had just seen. She crossed the street and knocked on his door. When he opened it, she stepped inside without asking. The air around her carried that same sweet metallic scent from the night before. She told him the person he had seen was from a rival clan, one that believed human involvement during mating season was a corruption of their traditions. Daniel asked why they would risk coming here, and she answered simply, "Because the process has already begun." He felt a jolt in his chest at her words. She explained that the drink he had taken in her chamber was more than a gesture. It was a signal to her kind that she had made her choice. Now there would be those determined to stop it. Daniel's thoughts swirled between disbelief and the sharp clarity of what he had witnessed. Lyra told him the bond, once complete, would make them stronger than either could be alone. But until then they were vulnerable. She warned him that any further contact would make him a target, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a flicker of concern. Daniel looked toward the darkened street beyond his door and felt the quiet no longer as safety but as a waiting threat. Somewhere in that silence the rival clan might already be watching, and though every instinct told him to retreat, he could not ignore the pull that had started the moment he saw the first flicker of light on her skin. It was no longer just curiosity binding him to her. It was something deeper, something that made him certain the danger was only beginning. The next evening the colony lay under a heavy quiet, the kind that pressed against the skin like a warning. Daniel had spent the day glancing toward Lyra's home, half expecting another shadow to appear at her door. When night finally came, she arrived without a sound, her presence filling the narrow space of his home. Before she even spoke, she told him that waiting any longer would put them both at greater risk. The rival clan would not stop, and the only way to protect him was to finish what had been started. Daniel followed her through the dimly lit streets until they reached her home, the door sliding shut behind them with a muted hiss that seemed to cut them off from the rest of the world. The low hum was stronger tonight, resonating in his chest as they moved down the narrow passage toward the chamber at the back. The moment they stepped inside, the air seemed to thicken. The intricate symbols on the floor pulsed with a slow light, and the walls shimmered with shifting patterns that seemed almost alive. Lyra removed the thin cloak she wore, revealing the full spread of glowing markings across her skin. They flared brighter as she stepped closer, the heat from her body reaching him before her hands did. She told him that the bond was more than a choice. It was a merging of will and memory, a thread that once tied could never be broken. Daniel felt his throat tighten as she produced a small silver bowl, filled with a clear liquid that caught the shifting lights above. She dipped her fingers into it and touched the center of his forehead, the liquid warm and oddly heavy, sinking into his skin like it belonged there. She gestured for him to step into the center of the symbols, his boots echoing against the stone. As he stood there, the patterns beneath his feet began to move, lines shifting and curling into new shapes. Lyra's voice filled the chamber, speaking in her language with a rhythm that made the air vibrate. Daniel felt his pulse match that rhythm. Then a sudden rush of heat spread from his chest to the tips of his fingers, his vision blurring until the chamber seemed to dissolve. He was no longer standing on stone, but on a wide plain under a deep violet sky, the air thick with the scent of strange flowers. Liara stood before him without the distance of walls or the weight of the storm, her eyes locking with his as flashes of memory poured into him, battles fought under alien suns, moments of quiet joy beside a crystal river, the ache of long solitude. The intensity of it almost dropped him to his knees, but she was there, steadying him, her hands warm and unyielding. She told him to focus, to let the connection take hold. Daniel felt his own memories rising unbidden, his childhood on Earth, the years of loneliness in the colony, the quiet evenings watching her balcony without understanding why. He realized she was seeing them as clearly as he was, and in that exchange something shifted, a thread pulling taut between them, the hum around them growing louder until it seemed to come from inside his own chest. Before the bond could seal, a sharp sound shattered the air. The door to the chamber slammed open, and figures rushed inside. The markings on their armor unfamiliar, but their intent clear. The rival clan had found them. Liara moved instantly, pushing Daniel back as she intercepted the first attacker with a sweep of her arm that sent him crashing into the wall. The glow of the floor flared violently, reacting to the intrusion. Daniel gripped the silver bowl instinctively, the liquid trembling within it as the fight erupted around him. He knew that if the bond was not completed, now they might never get another chance, yet stepping forward meant committing to something that would change his life forever. And in the flickering light of the chamber, with the sound of battle echoing off the stone, he realized that the choice could no longer be delayed. The chamber was chaos lit by the violent glow of the shift-in floor patterns and the sudden flashes of weapons clashing. Liara moved like a streak of living light, intercepting every strike that came near Daniel, yet more figures poured through. The doorway, their movements fast and precise, their armor marked with the jagged crest of the rival clan. Daniel felt the pull of the unfinished bond thrumming inside him, each heartbeat echoing the strange hum of the symbols beneath his feet. He gripped the silver bowl tighter, knowing instinctively that spilling even a drop would end whatever chance they had. One of the attackers broke past Liara and came straight for him, but Daniel reacted faster than he thought possible, swinging the bowl up into the alien's arm, with enough force to knock the weapon away. The attacker staggered back, and in that moment Daniel realized his reflexes were sharper, his muscles quicker, as if Lyra's strength was already bleeding into him. Liara shouted something in her own tongue, and the markings on her skin flared so bright it hurt to look at her. She drove the attackers back toward the door, but they regrouped outside, the sound of their boots on stone echoing through the corridor as more approached. Daniel moved to her side, the heat between them almost physical now. She told him they had to leave the chamber and reach a place where the bond could be finished without interruption. They ran through a side passage, the glow of the symbols fading behind them. The air in the narrow tunnel was hot and heavy with the scent of dust and something sharper. Daniel could hear movement all around them, the rival clan trying to cut them off. They emerged into an open hall carved into the rock-high windows, spilling pale light from the alien moon outside. Liara led him toward a set of stone steps that spiraled upward, her voice low as she explained that completing the bond would make them a single unit in the eyes of her people, and that once it was done, no clan could challenge it without igniting a war they could not win. Daniel's mind spun with the weight of her words, but the pounding of boots on the steps below pushed any hesitation aside. They reached the top to find a platform open to the night air. The distant lights of the colony spread out below like a scatter of stars. Liara stepped into the center of the platform and motioned for him to follow. She drew a thin blade from her belt, slicing a shallow cut across her palm. Her blood shimmered like liquid silver. She offered the blade to him, and he hesitated only a breath before mirroring the gesture. Their hands met, and the heat of the touch burned in a way that was not pain, but something deeper. The glow of her markings spread onto his skin, tracing patterns along his arms. The sensation was dizzying. He could feel her heartbeat as if it was his own. Thoughts and images flooding his mind so fast he could barely separate them from his own memories. Before the connection could lock into place, a sharp whistle cut through the air, and a projectile struck the stone at their feet, exploding into a burst of smoke and heat. Figures rushed from the shadows of the rooftop surrounding the platform. The rival clan had found them again. Liara pulled him close, shielding him with her body as another shot rang out. Daniel felt the bond strain inside him like a thread pulled too tight. If they broke contact now, everything would be undone. The attackers closed in, their weapons gleaming in the moonlight. Liara's voice was urgent in his mind, now not his ears telling him they had to finish it no matter what. Daniel tightened, his grip on her hand, the silver of her blood mixing with his own. And in that moment he understood that running was no longer an option. The hunt was over, the stand would be here, and its outcome would decide whether they lived together or died together. The smoke from the blast still clung to the air, curling around them as shapes moved through it, fast and silent, the rival clan closing in with weapons drawn, their eyes glinting with cold intent under the pale alien moon. Liara tightened her grip on Daniel's hand, the heat of their mingled blood pulsing between them like a living current. Her voice cut through the chaos, low but urgent, telling him that they had only seconds to decide. Finish the bond now and stand together, or break it, and she would fight alone. Daniel's breath came hard, the sound of boots scraping on stone growing louder each heartbeat. The bond was a living thing inside him, stretching thin like a wire, ready to snap. His mind flashing between the safety of retreat and the pull of something far deeper than instinct. Lyra's eyes held his unblinking, steady and fierce, the light of her markings flickering in rhythm with his own pulse. An attacker burst from the smoke, swinging a curved blade aimed for Lyra's side, but Daniel moved before he could think, the spear in his free hand meeting the strike with a sharp metallic crack. The shock of the impact rang up his arm, yet he didn't falter, his body moving with a precision he had never known. The bond already bleeding its strength into him, Liara used the opening to drive the attacker back, her movements so fluid they seemed almost like light itself. Another figure came from the left, but Daniel's senses caught it before his eyes did, and he pivoted, the spear sweeping low to send the assailant crashing to the stone. The sound of the fight rose around them, boots pounding, weapons striking sparks into the air, the smell of blood and scorched metal mixing in the cold wind. Liara's voice pressed into his mind again, this time not a plea but a command. Finish it now. She pulled him closer, their joined hands lifting as the patterns on her skin blazed brighter than ever, wrapping around his arm. Like living fire, the sensation tore through him in a flood of memories, not just hers, but their own shared. Moments replayed in flashes, the first glance across the boundary wall, the storm when she came to his door, the black stone warm in his palm, each moment now etched into the bond as if sealing it in unbreakable glass. The heat reached his chest, spreading outward until it felt like the air itself was bending around them. Another blast shook the platform, showering them with fragments of stone. The rival clan shouting in their own tongue as they pressed forward. Daniel's knees trembled under the weight of the bond settling into place, but he refused to break contact. The final moment came like a silent pulse, a shock that ran from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. And in that heartbeat, he could feel her completely, her strength, her fear, her unwavering resolve, the connection locking into place like two halves of the same blade. Attackers hesitated for the first time, perhaps sensing the shift in the air. Liara released his hand only to draw her blade, her body moving in perfect sync with his as they turned to face the remaining fighters together. The fight was different now, every motion mirrored every strike flowing between them. Like shared thought, they drove the rival clan back, step by step, until the last of them fled into the shadows, leaving the platform littered with the remnants of battle, the wind sweeping away the last curls of smoke. Breathing hard, Daniel looked at her and realized the choice had been made, not in the moment of the fight but long before, when he had first stepped toward her across the thin boundary wall. Lyra's gaze softened for the first time that night, yet behind it was the same fire. The bond was complete, and with it came the certainty that whatever dangers lay ahead, they would face them not as two, but as one, and nothing could unmake what had just been forged in blood and light under the alien sky. The platform was silent, except for the low moan of the wind winding through the broken stone, and the faint echo of footsteps fading into the night. The rival clan had vanished into the shadows, leaving behind only the scattered glint of dropped weapons and the scent of scorched metal. Daniel stood with the spear still in his grip, his body trembling not from fear, but from the strange energy coursing through him. The bond was no longer a thread pulling at his chest, it was a constant presence, pressing against every thought and heartbeat. Liara stood beside him, her breathing steady, her markings still glowing though softer now, her eyes fixed on the horizon, as if already looking beyond the night's battle. She told him in a voice that carried no doubt that from this moment on they were bound in every way, her survival now tied to his and his to hers, and that meant every threat to her was now his enemy as well. They left the platform, moving through the high stone corridors back toward the heart of the colony, the path lit by narrow beams of moonlight spilling through the cracks overhead. Daniel felt a strange awareness growing with every step. He could sense her without looking, could feel the shift of her emotions like faint ripples in his own mind. When she tensed at a sound, he tensed too. When she slowed to listen, his own steps matched hers. Without thought they passed into the lower streets, where the signs of the attack had already begun to draw whispers from the other settlers, humans and aliens, both leaning from doorways to watch them pass, some with curiosity, some with open distrust. Liara ignored them, her focus unshaken, but Daniel could feel the weight of their stares pressing against them both. When they reached her home, she sealed the door behind them and led him back into the chamber where it had all begun. The symbols on the floor now dim, the hum low and steady like the heartbeat of something sleeping. She told him the bond had finished just in time. Had they been interrupted even a breath earlier, it would have left them both vulnerable, perhaps even killed them. She admitted she had not told him everything about mating season, that it was not just a choice of the heart but also a rare event in her species that attracted attention from all factions, some wishing to see it flourish, others to see it crushed before it could change the balance of power. Daniel listened, the realization sinking deeper with every word that he was no longer an outsider to her world. He was inside it now, inextricably. In the days that followed, the colony seemed to shift around them. Strangers approached, Liara with guarded respect, some offering cryptic warnings, others offering quiet congratulations. Daniel trained with her in the mornings, learning to move with his new reflexes, the coordination between them, growing sharper until even in silence, they could anticipate each other's actions at night. He would feel her presence even when she was across the room, the bond humming faintly in the back of his mind, like a reminder that he was never truly alone, yet the unease never fully left him. Shadows lingered in the streets longer than they should, figures watched from rooftops before melting away, and more than once he felt an emotion from her, that she tried to hide, a flicker of tension that told him she knew. The danger was far from over. One evening, as they stood on her balcony looking out at the alien sky, she told him that mating season would end soon, but the consequences of their bond would remain for life in the eyes of her people. He was no longer just a human neighbor, he was her chosen partner, her bonded. And that title came with responsibility, power, and danger. In equal measure, Daniel felt the truth of it in the steady connection between them, the sense that whatever paths lay ahead they would walk together under the same sky and in the same fight as the wind curled around them, carrying the distant hum of the colony. He knew with absolute certainty that nothing in his life could ever return to the way it had been before the night she came to his door and changed everything forever. If you love thrilling HFY sci-fi stories like this, turn on the bell icon so you never miss the next twist in our sci-fi universe. Make sure to hit that subscribe button